Long evening shadows stretched across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as the last rays of summer sun glinted off the ornate gates. The thinning crowd of tourists was starting to disperse. Jonathan Cooper, a man of 65, walked slowly, his weathered face bearing the quiet dignity of age. His Royal Air Force veteran's pin caught the fading light as he paused to catch his breath, one hand unconsciously moving toward the inhaler in his jacket pocket. Guard Ashford stood at his post, his scarlet uniform a vivid splash of color against the palace's gray stones. At 28, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who understood the weight of tradition he represented. His eyes, trained by years of military service, noticed everything, including the slight wheeze in Cooper's breathing and the two figures who had taken an unsettling interest in the elderly veteran. Greg Mitchell and Danny Harris lounged against a nearby pillar, their expensive tracksuits and pristine sneakers at odds with their predatory postures. Greg, the taller of the two, nudged his companion as Cooper walked past. "Look at this old-timer," he muttered, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of London's rougher areas. "Bet that pin's worth something." Danny's eyes narrowed, catching the slight tremor in Cooper's movements, the way his hand kept straying to his pocket. "Looks like he's carrying two," he whispered back. "Medicine, probably. These old guys always have something good on them." Cooper felt their stares but kept walking, his military training from decades past alerting him to potential trouble. The evening air felt thick in his lungs, and he could sense an asthma attack coming on, with the worst possible timing. His fingers brushed the inhaler in his pocket, reassuring himself it was still there. Guard Ashford remained motionless, but his attention had sharpened. Through years of standing watch, he'd learned to read the signs of an impending confrontation. The way Greg and Danny had shifted their weight, their calculated positioning to intercept Cooper's path. These weren't random tourists admiring the palace. These were predators who'd spotted what they thought was easy prey. The remaining tourists moved in their usual pattern, snapping photos and consulting guidebooks, unaware of the drama beginning to unfold. But there was tension in the air now, a subtle charge that made parents pull their children closer and couples quicken their pace as they passed the two young men. Cooper's wheezing had become more pronounced, each breath a visible struggle that made his shoulders rise and fall with concerning irregularity. The evening air, though mild, seemed to catch in his throat as his airways began to constrict. The familiar tightness in his chest signaled the onset of an asthma attack, something he'd dealt with since his service days. "Struggling there, old man." Greg's voice carried across the courtyard, deliberately loud enough to draw attention. He and Danny had closed half the distance, their movements casual but calculated, like wolves circling wounded prey. "Looking a bit peaked, aren't you?" Cooper's hand moved to his jacket pocket again, fingers curling around the inhaler. Years of military service had taught him to stay calm in a crisis, but his body was betraying him. Each step became more deliberate as he tried to maintain his dignity while fighting for breath. "Maybe he needs some help, Greg," Danny called out, his mock concern fooling no one. "Looks like he's got something interesting in that pocket he keeps checking." Their voices carried an edge that made nearby tourists quicken their pace, parents steering their children toward the palace gates with nervous glances over their shoulders. Guard Ashford stood immobile, but his trained eye caught every detail. The slight tremor in Cooper's hands, the increasing desperation in his breathing, the predatory grace in Greg and Danny's movements. His own breathing remained measured, controlled, as he watched the distance between them shrink. "Oi, veteran," Greg called out again, closer now. "RAF, is it? Must have been something back in the day." His tone dripped with sarcasm as he nodded toward Cooper's service pin. "A bit past your prime now, though, aren't you?" Cooper tried to straighten his posture, military pride warring with physical distress. His fingers tightened around the inhaler, knowing he'd need it soon but reluctant to show weakness in front of these circling vultures. Each breath came shorter than the last, the familiar panic of an attack building in his chest. "Look at him, Danny." Greg's voice dropped lower, meant for his companion but pitched to carry. "Reckon whatever he's got in that pocket might be worth a look. They were flanking Cooper now, their movements practiced, coordinated, clearly not their first time targeting someone vulnerable. A young couple paused nearby, the man taking half a step forward as if to intervene, but Danny's quick, threatening glance sent them hurrying away. The remaining tourists had created a wide berth around the scene, their holiday photos forgotten as they watched the situation unfold with growing unease. Cooper's vision began to blur slightly at the edges, his lungs fighting for air. The inhaler was a reassuring weight in his pocket, but reaching for it now, he realized, would only confirm his vulnerability to these predators. His military training screamed at him to maintain tactical awareness, but the growing lack of oxygen made everything seem distant, dreamlike. Guard Ashford's knuckles whitened imperceptibly on his rifle as Greg and Danny moved into position on either side of Cooper. His ceremonial stance remained perfect, but there was a new tension in his bearing, the coiled readiness of a soldier recognizing imminent conflict. "Time for a friendly chat, I think," Greg announced, his smile never reaching his eyes, as he and Danny closed the final distance to their target. "Let's see what you've got in that pocket, old-timer." Greg stepped directly into Cooper's path, forcing him to stop, his height advantage letting him loom over the veteran, whose breathing had become audibly strained. Danny circled behind, cutting off any route of retreat. "I'm just trying to get home," Cooper managed between labored breaths, his military bearings still evident despite his distress. The RAF pin on his jacket caught the fading light as his chest heaved with effort. Greg's face twisted into a mocking smile. "Oh, we'll help you get home, right after you share whatever it is you keep touching in that pocket." He moved closer, deliberately pushing into Cooper's personal space. "Must be something good if you're guarding it so closely." A small group of tourists had stopped to watch, their expressions a mixture of concern and uncertainty. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her British accent crisp with authority. "Leave him alone. Can't you see he's unwell?" "Mind your own business, love," Danny snapped, his tone carrying enough threat to make her step back. "Just having a friendly chat with our veteran here." His eyes never left Cooper as he completed his flanking position. Cooper's military training warred with his body's desperate need for air. He could feel the attack worsening, his airways constricting further with each passing moment. The inhaler in his pocket felt like it weighed a ton, but reaching for it now would only give these predators exactly what they wanted. 30 years Royal Air Force, Cooper wheezed out, trying to appeal to some sense of respect or patriotism. "Please, I need to..." 30 years, Greg cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Well, look at you now, hero. Can't even catch your breath." He glanced at Guard Ashford's position, then back to Cooper with a sneer. "At least you're not standing around like a statue pretending to be useful." Guard Ashford remained motionless, but his eyes tracked every movement. Years of combat training had taught him to read situations, to anticipate actions before they happened. The way Greg's weight shifted, how Danny's hand stayed loose at his sides. These weren't random thugs. They'd done this before. "Maybe if you ask nicely," Danny taunted, moving closer to Cooper's right side. "We'll let you keep your precious pin after we're done. Bit of respect for your service, and all that." His laugh carried no humor, only malice. Cooper's vision was starting to tunnel slightly, the lack of oxygen becoming critical. His hand moved involuntarily toward his pocket again, a motion that didn't go unnoticed by his tormentors. "There it is again." Greg's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Whatever you've got in there must be really special." He stepped even closer, his breath hot on Cooper's face. "Let's have a look, shall we?" The remaining tourists had backed away further, forming a loose circle around the scene. A father covered his young son's eyes, hurrying him toward the gates. An American couple filmed discreetly on their phone, but a sharp look from Danny made them lower quickly. "Please," Cooper managed, his breathing now alarmingly labored. "I need my medicine." "Medicine?" Greg's eyes lit up with cruel interest. "Well, why didn't you say so?" He looked at Danny, who nodded with equal malice. "We should definitely have a look at that. Wouldn't want you taking something dangerous, would we? Guard Ashford's perfect posture concealed the combat-ready tension in his muscles. Every instinct honed through years of military service told him the situation was about to escalate. Last chance, old man. Greg's voice hardened as Cooper swayed slightly, struggling for air. Show us what you've got, or we'll have to help ourselves. Greg's hand shot out with practiced speed, grabbing Cooper's jacket and yanking him forward. The sudden movement sent the veteran stumbling, his already labored breathing becoming more desperate. Danny moved in smoothly, his hands immediately finding and emptying Cooper's pocket. Well, Danny held up the inhaler, turning it in the fading light. What have we got here? Looks expensive. His fingers wrapped around the medical device as Cooper struggled to stay upright, one hand clutching his chest. Give that back, Cooper wheezed, years of military command trying to enter his voice despite his failing breath. I need it. I can't. His words dissolved into a fit of desperate gasping that made him grab onto a nearby railing for support. You need it. Greg's voice took on a sing-song quality as he watched Cooper struggle. Should have said please, shouldn't you? He nodded to Danny, who began tossing the inhaler from hand to hand like a toy. Maybe we can work something out. What's it worth to you? Cooper's knees began to buckle, his face taking on an alarming shade of gray. His RAF pin glinted as his chest heaved with increasingly futile attempts to draw air. Please, he managed, the word barely audible. Combat veteran. 30 years combat veteran. Greg's laugh was sharp and cruel. Look at you now. Tough guy. Can't even stand up straight. He moved closer, deliberately invading Cooper's space again. All those medals and honors. And here you are begging street lads for your medicine. Guard Ashford's eyes hadn't moved, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight as a spring. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Cooper's condition deteriorating rapidly. The veteran's lips were starting to take on a bluish tinge, a dangerous sign he recognized from his medical training. Might be worth something, Danny mused, still playing with the inhaler. These things don't come cheap, do they? Military pension must be good for something. He held it just out of Cooper's reaching distance, watching the older man's desperate attempts to grab it. A few tourists had tried to approach again, but Greg's threatening glare kept them at bay. Anyone else want to play hero? He called out to the crowd. No? Didn't think so. This is between us and our friend here. His hand shot out, grabbing Cooper's RAF pin and ripping it from his jacket. Souvenir for our trouble. Cooper's legs finally gave way, sending him to his knees on the courtyard stones. His fingers scraped against the ground as he fought to stay conscious, each breath a terrible, wheezing battle that grew weaker by the second. Years of military service flashed through his mind. Medals, ceremonies, combat missions, Queen's honors, all reduced to this moment of helplessness. Not so high and mighty now, are you? Greg crouched down beside Cooper, his voice dripping false concern. All that service, all that duty, and look how it ends. On your knees, begging the likes of us for help. He grabbed Cooper's chin, forcing the veteran to look at him. This is what happens when you get old, hero. World moves on, leaves you behind. His boot nudged Cooper's side. Not quite a kick, but a clear threat of worse to come. Cooper's vision was starting to darken at the edges, his desperate gasps growing weaker. The world had narrowed to the sight of his inhaler in Danny's hand. Tantalizingly close, but impossibly far in his current state. His service-hardened pride had crumbled in the face of basic survival, but even that didn't seem to matter anymore. The evening air had grown colder, or perhaps it was just a lack of oxygen, making everything feel distant and chill. Greg and Danny's taunting voices seemed to come from far away now, their cruel laughter mixing with the concerned murmurs of the helpless crowd as Cooper's consciousness began to fade. His last clear thought was of the irony. Surviving combat only to face this end on the very grounds he'd sworn to protect. 30 years of service, Greg announced to the horrified onlookers, and all it gets you is this. With deliberate cruelty, he snatched the inhaler from Danny's hand and held it in front of Cooper's face. The veteran's eyes, now glazed with oxygen deprivation, tracked the life-saving device with desperate focus. Cooper tried to reach for it, his movements growing uncoordinated as his body fought for air. His lips had turned an alarming shade of blue, each breath now a shallow, ineffective gasp that barely moved his chest. Decades of military bearing had been reduced to this, sprawled on the courtyard stones at the mercy of two heartless tormentors. Please, the word was barely audible, more mouthed than spoken. Cooper's hand trembled in the air between them, reaching for the inhaler that Greg now dangled just inches from his face. Listen to that, Danny. Greg's voice carried theatrical disappointment. Still hasn't learned proper manners, has he? With calculated malice, he lowered the inhaler to ground level. Maybe this will help the lesson sink in. The sound of plastic cracking under Greg's boot cut through the evening air like a gunshot. Cooper's eyes widened in horror as he watched his lifeline being crushed into useless fragments, pieces of the inhaler scattering across the stones like shrapnel. Oops! Greg twisted his heel, grinding the remaining pieces into dust. Looks like someone's going to have a rough night. He kicked the broken remnants toward Cooper's face, watching as the veteran's struggles grew weaker. Danny laughed, but there was a new edge to it. Even he seemed unsettled by how far things had gone. Mate, maybe we should... Should what? Greg rounded on his companion. Show them mercy, like the world shows any of us mercy. He turned back to Cooper, whose desperate gasps had become alarmingly quiet. This is what happens when you outlive your usefulness, old man. No one's coming to save you. Not your precious RF. Not these tourists watching, not soldiers, not anyone. The crowd had grown larger but remained helplessly distant, held back by fear and uncertainty. Parents covered their children's eyes. Tourists lowered their cameras in shame, and a collective feeling of horror settled over the gathering like a heavy shroud. Cooper's consciousness was fading fast. The world had narrowed to pinpricks of light in a darkening void, each failed breath bringing him closer to the edge. His military training, his combat experience, his years of service, none of it mattered in the face of this basic, primal need for air. Guard Ashford stood at his post, his exterior a picture of ceremonial discipline. But behind that mask of stillness, every combat-honed instinct was screaming. He could see Cooper's condition deteriorating by the second, could read the signs of imminent collapse in the veteran's weakening struggles. Look at him now. Greg continued his taunting, circling Cooper's crumpled form like a vulture. This is what all your service gets you. Dying on the street while people watch, while your fancy guard stands are doing nothing. He spat on the ground near Cooper's face. Some protection they provide, huh? Cooper's hand fell limply to his side, his struggles growing feeble. The darkness was closing in, each heartbeat thundering in his ears as his body fought its losing battle for oxygen. His glazing eyes found Guard Ashford's post, and something like understanding passed between them, soldier to soldier, across generations of service. The evening sun had dipped below the palace walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. In the gathering darkness, no one noticed the subtle shift in Guard Ashford's stance, the minute tensing of muscles, the fractional adjustment of his grip, the combat-ready positioning of his feet. The calm before the storm, the transition from ceremonial statue to combat soldier happened in the blink of an eye. Guard Ashford's movement was a blur of scarlet and precision as he crossed the courtyard, his ceremonial rifle secured across his back with practiced efficiency. Years of Special Forces training took over, turning his dress uniform into battle armor. Before Greg could fully register the movement, a white-gloved hand clamped onto his shoulder with crushing force. The grip spoke of countless hours of combat training, each finger positioned to inflict maximum control with minimum effort. Greg's sneer froze on his face as he was spun around with military precision. What the? His words cut off as Ashford's other hand shot out, catching his throat in a precise hold that wasn't quite a choke, but carried the clear promise of becoming one. The guard's eyes, no longer fixed on the middle distance, bore into Greg's with the intensity of a combat veteran. Danny started forward, but froze as Ashford's boot connected with the back of Greg's knee, sending him crashing to the ground with a controlled violence that spoke of extensive close-quarters combat experience. The movement was fluid, economical, and absolutely decisive. "Stay exactly where you are." Ashford's voice carried the unmistakable command tone of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Danny's hands went up automatically, survival instinct recognizing real authority. Without releasing his grip on Greg, Ashford reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a backup inhaler, standard equipment for guards trained to assist in medical emergencies. His movement toward Cooper was precise and controlled, keeping Greg subdued while covering the distance to the veteran in 2 efficient steps. "RF command, sir." Ashford's voice was crisp as he pressed the inhaler into Cooper's trembling hand. "Deep breath, on my mark." The military protocol seemed to reach through Cooper's oxygen-deprived haze, decades of service responding to the chain of command. Greg attempted to twist free, but Ashford's grip tightened with crushing force. "Try that again." The guard's voice was deadly quiet, and you'll learn exactly what ceremonial means in the Queen's Guard. There was nothing ceremonial in his tone or the way his fingers found pressure points that made Greg gasp. Cooper triggered the inhaler, precious medication flowing into his starved lungs. Color slowly returned to his face as his breathing began to stabilize. Each supervised inhalation was monitored by Ashford with medical precision, even as he maintained absolute control over Greg. Danny edged toward the crowd, but Ashford's voice stopped him cold. 3 steps back. Hands where I can see them. The command brooked no argument, and Danny found himself obeying before he could think about it. 8 years Special Forces. Ashford spoke matter-of-factly, his grip never wavering. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. This uniform isn't a costume. It's a reminder that some of us still stand ready. His fingers tightened fractionally on Greg's throat, ready to protect those who served before us, from creatures like you. Police whistles pierced the evening air as palace security finally arrived, but Ashford's control of the situation never wavered. His bearing remained pure military as he efficiently transferred Greg to the custody of law enforcement, his movements so precise they could have been a drill demonstration. "The gentleman needs medical attention," Ashford informed the arriving officers, his voice carrying parade ground authority. "And these 2 need processing for assault, theft of medical equipment, and harassing a veteran on palace grounds." His eyes met Greg's with cold disdain. "I'll be filing a complete report." The police efficiently secured Greg and Danny, their handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that echoed across the courtyard. Greg's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by impotent rage as he was led away. His attempts to threaten legal action met with cold professionalism from officers who had seen the entire incident. Assaulting a veteran, theft of medical equipment, threatening behavior on palace grounds. The senior officer listed the charges, each one wiping more color from Danny's face. "The Crown takes these matters very seriously, gentlemen, especially with a Queen's Guard as witness." His tone suggested this wouldn't be a brief legal process. Paramedics had arrived to attend to Cooper, but the veteran waved off their offers of hospital transport. Once his breathing stabilized, his military bearing had returned with his oxygen, shoulders straight despite the evening's ordeal. The torn spot where his RAF pin had been seen to accuse Greg as he was led past. "You'll be hearing from the Crown Prosecution Service," the officer informed the detained pair. "I imagine they'll be quite interested in your views on veterans and palace security." His tone suggested this wouldn't be a brief legal process. Greg's face contorted with fury as he was guided toward the waiting police vehicle. "This isn't over," he shouted, straining against the handcuffs. "You can't." "Yes, it is over." The officer cut him off flatly, quite definitively. The police car door shut on further protests, finally silencing the evening's disruption. Cooper stood slowly, supported by a paramedic, but maintaining his dignity. His eyes met Guard Ashford's for a moment, a look between soldiers that needed no words. Decades of service, sacrifice, and understanding passed between them in that silent exchange. The veteran straightened his jacket, nobility returning with every steady breath. Without speaking, he drew himself to attention and offered Guard Ashford a precise salute. The guard returned it with perfect military form, the gesture carrying more weight than any words could convey. "Your service is not forgotten, sir," he said quietly, "not by those who understand its cost." After that, Guard Ashford resumed his watch. His posture was exactly as regulations demanded, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. But now there was no mistaking the warrior behind the ceremony. Meanwhile, Greg and Danny vanished into the legal system, their bravado crushed under the weight of Crown prosecution, their names added to a long list of those who learned too late that some traditions carry steel beneath their ceremony. What would you have done in Guard Ashford's position? How long would you have waited before intervening? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe traditional ceremonial roles like the Queen's Guard still have a place in our modern world? Share your perspective with our community. If the story touched you and you believe in preserving respect for our veterans and traditions, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps spread these important messages to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the Royal Guards who stand as living symbols of dignity, duty, and unwavering dedication. These aren't just men in ceremonial uniforms. They're highly trained soldiers who embody the finest tradition of military service. Press that bell icon to ensure you never miss our upcoming stories. Each one carries important lessons about respect, honor, and the consequences of forgetting our shared values. Check out our previous videos appearing on your screen right now. From confrontations with disrespectful tourists to moments of unexpected heroism, each story reminds us why these traditions endure. Until next time, remember, true strength isn't measured by how much power you have, but by how you use it to protect those who need it most.